time? Okay, fantastic. Welcome again. So a little bit again about the housekeeping. I'm going to ask if you're finding this information that we're going to be recording, you like it, heart it, okay? Especially if you're watching us on Facebook, as my understanding is that they like the hearts more than they like the likes. The thumbs up are kind of, whatever. I hope you're going to find that the information we got here is gold, because today's subject is the 5 dangers non-for-profit organizations face when they rely on government and corporate grants for their major source of their funding. This is a bit controversial perhaps for some. I know a lot of organizations, a lot of nonprofit organizations rely on grants as a major source of their funding. And some of them, it's as up to 100%. I've seen of them there. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit of the 5 dangers of that, and then 4 strategies for boards. And this is a challenge I put out to boards, because this is an area of leadership that boards of directors of not-for-profit organizations, associations, and the like need to exercise leadership in. So if you're interested in hearing about this, put the hearts into the comment there, share it as well, but most of all, leave a little bit of a hashtag saying preach on, or if you're watching this live, put a hashtag watching live, or even if you're watching this in the replay, put the hashtag replay as well. I'll endeavor to reach out to you as well if you're so interested. You can get the recording for this, or even the transcripts at a later date if you're so inclined for that. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to talk to you about the 5 dangers, first of all, of involvement or overdependence. And I'm going to call this almost, in some respect, a situation of, unfortunately, almost as a drug dependency, frankly. Maybe this is a bit of extreme, and I'm sorry if I'm going to offend those people who are in that field. It's not my intention there, but my intention is to grab your attention to this. I so firmly believe that the reliance on this sector on grants creates what I call, or what's been referred to as, the nonprofit starvation cycle. Let me explain. First point, and this is the first danger. Now, a recent study I read about from Stanford University said that organizations that succeed, and this is private or nonprofit, who succeed rely on building robust infrastructure. And I mean by that, if they've got solid IT capabilities, they've got financial systems to be able to oversee the organization, make sure that it's running well. They've got HR processes in place to be able to go out and recruit and retain the best of people as well. They are able to invest as well in skill sets so that they can continue developing their people. They, as a result, can do better by the organization as well. They basically have much of the needed infrastructure to run the organization. At least they're a decent place to go to work, frankly. That's not, the rain isn't coming through the roof, if you will. These are some basic things that in any kind of organization, private would just be a no-brainer there. Yet because of funder limits often that are placed within the grant applications and in order to keep that funding there, overhead is never really placed as a very high priority. In fact, much to the contrary, it forces nonprofits to go on a constant battle of showing how they're able to cut back on overhead. Now, I'm a firm believer that there's a reasonable level of what you call overhead or percentage. You shouldn't have up to 100% like that. And that's a whole other subject on this. But obviously, for an organization to be able to run, it needs a certain amount of its investment towards its basic infrastructure and keeping the lights on, if you will. Now, most of the executive directors, if you have a coffee with them, they will agree that this is so important. And frankly, it's a real frustrating aspect for them, the fact that they can't invest as much as they would like on this. But at the same time, in order to keep the funding coming in and keep the organization coming in, they loathe the aspect of having to make improvements because of the perception of creating higher overhead. Even if the consultants and all the experts and the board say, you know what, you should invest in your people more, you should think about ways that you can increase salaries to keep good people, and all these other kinds of things that are required or are considered a no-brainer in most organizations. In fact, the same study from Stanford surveyed over 1,500 nonprofit organizations in the United States, and it found in most of them that their IT and financial systems were so subpar that they couldn't track outcomes. Now, here's the irony of it. Most grant funders, one of the things that they look for in order to fund you, or who they're going to fund and who they're not going to fund, is they want you to clearly demonstrate outcome for the investment made. Now, this sets, as a result, a very much an unrealistic expectation on how much it actually costs to run an organization. Yes, folks, it costs money. It costs money to run a nonprofit organization, and it sets them on a continual cycle of starving and begging and starving and begging to get the funds, But through this ridiculous process, this maniacal process there, it forces all organizations to say, well, how did you measure and benchmark last year and compared to this year in terms of reducing your overhead? And it forces, as a result, unrealistic reporting and data that's just not even really matched up this, because on one hand, the nonprofit goes begging cap in hand for money to be able to run the organization. And on the other hand, as well, the funders saying, well, this year we saw across the board, all of these organizations that we fund, they're reducing it. Why isn't your organization doing the same? Now, this is not just specific towards just charitable organizations, although the latter that I'm mentioning does have a high relevance to this. If you're on the board of a not-for-profit association, stay tuned, because there's some other dangers of this. The second danger of relying on grants is that it cuts back the freedom of the board of directors to decide on the future direction of the organization, which in itself is a huge undermining of the role of the board itself. The role of the board is to be able to look forward and to future project as to what's going on. I've seen and heard of grants where they will offer funding to be able to go out and hire a specific person, but the requirements around that is they want this kind of a profile. Well, what if that type of person really isn't the type of person that the organization needs or is ready to go about? What happens if, for example, the amounts being offered in the grant to hire that person are not set in tune with the market standards to be able to get the best and brightest people in this? And then there's the other aspect of it as well, is that not always do these funding amounts account for all the extras that come about with hiring somebody. When you hire somebody, you're not just responsible for their salary. You have benefits to consider, if you're able to offer them at all. You have other payroll requirements and remittances that have to go to government institutes. That's sometimes, depending on where you are in this world. I can speak for Canada, and from what I've heard a little bit in the United States, but in Canada, it can be as much as 1.4 times, the salary, those extra costs there. I've heard in the United States can be sometimes as much as 7 times, frankly, of the challenge there. So these factors have to be thought about. The other aspect, and I'll get on to as well, is that often these funding organizations have little pet projects about what they think is important. And as a result, it doesn't allow the board independence of thought to be able to project and where it sees the biggest factors is. It has to go, again, cap in hand, explaining why they make big issue with this. And it forces often, and I've seen this, organizations where trade associations, where their mandate might not necessarily be, it might be more about representing their members or advancing professionalism in their profession or their trade, but because they need a little bit of extra, think that they're going to be able to get a little bit extra, that they go off and they create a whole separate pet project program that's in line with what a given government wants to do or a funding agency wants to do, that really just sets the whole mission off on a whole tangent on this. And then the whole bigger question is, and this is the irony of it, this is the kicker of it, sometimes these funding organizations will even have the call to ask you, how will you sustain this funding or this program should the funding end? Well, that's a good question you need to be asking yourself. Do you really want to be going down this path? The third reason why this is such a dangerous factor is that in the search and the continual goose hunt, frankly, after these grants, often nonprofit boards fail to ask themselves the fundamental question of how do we factor in the time and the staff time needed to be able to search, hunt for, reply, and tailor all of these grant applications in relation to the money. Let me explain. The study that I mentioned earlier brought in another really interesting factor. It found that sometimes as much as 31% of a grant value, okay, the grant value money, was actually spent in servicing, administering, searching, and servicing and administering the grant itself. 31%. So assuming, and that's in staff time. Now this is a factor maybe that's not built into this. Maybe from the private sector, at least in the agency world or private professional services where everything is timed down in block hours, this is a factor that's important. But it's really important as well when you've got a small organization and resources, your human capital is so important, it has to be maximized. So think of it this way. Assuming you had a $100,000 grant, okay, sounds great for a small charitable organization, association, whatever that is. But it costs you in staff time, if that staff time were to actually bill out $31,000 to actually administer it, okay, fair, and you're still left with 65 or whatever, the 60 odd grand or so that's left over at this. 69 there. How much have you really gained out of this? Has it been really worth the incremental gain that you've had on your budget line? Whereas often enough, the interesting thing is that because much of these funders are cognizant of this, or they think they're cognizant of this, they have really, in generally truth, no idea how much it actually costs to be able to administer these things there. They mandate sometimes that no more than 13% of the value of the grant be dedicated to its administration. So there's some really serious imbalances between the two. The fourth biggest reason or danger is that, as I think I might have mentioned, and this is particularly, I see this happening, this thirst for grants comes among startup organizations. The truth of the fact matter is that most grant funding organizations want to have some kind of proof of concept, the fact that you've actually made it somewhere, that you've had an impact as well. So they want a history of success. And as a result, it's not for something that never happened. I've never seen it happen where startup organizations don't get grant funding. It's just a tougher slug for all that effort that you've got to go in for it. And the fifth biggest reason is that in the long term, I've said this in a previous broadcast as well about the dangers of relying on grants, is that in the long run, it's really just so unsustainable, particularly if you're dealing with government. Often enough, an idea or a project might come in or a trend might come in any given point in time. It's funded, and then 3 to 4 or 5 years down the line, well, this is no longer a priority for us. And then what? Or on the flip side, I've heard of stories of trade association had gotten funding for a educational training program that would help their members to be able to educate them on learning the trade and picking up the trade. They got the funding, and because of the very economical ability that we're able to offer to their members, that attracted members in. But the moment the funding was no longer there, the moment that the funding was not able to continue doing the project, well, they dropped the value of the organization, and those members that they had acquired who wanted to join because of the program said, well, you know what, we don't really see the value. See, the organization, what this association did is it put on a false sense of security onto the organization. If you really want to go down the route of granting, my recommendation is that you set a goal, a longer term goal, that no more than 20% of your budget and your revenues should come from granting. You don't want to be dealing with or getting into bed with a fair weather partner. You want partners that are going to be with you in the long run. So instead of getting into bed with grant there, instead of relying on the constant nonprofit starvation cycle, instead of this, almost a codependent reliancy, I would call it, on grant funding organizations, I'm going to recommend to you 4 things that you could do. If you're really interested in learning a little bit more about what that would look like, heart this, make a little comment down below and share it, and leave me your thoughts on this, okay? Get the word out again. We're out on Periscope, we're out on YouTube, and we are on Facebook through the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors page. Okay, so the first thing that you need to be doing to get yourself off this is a longer term, a 4-step process. Is 1, you as an organization, you as a board, need to be insistent upon building up your donor or prospect list. And what I mean by donor or prospect list, that can be either donors, it can be prospective sponsors, it can be members, or if that's what your thing is about. The second thing that you need to be doing is you need to be establishing a very clear long-term strategic plan that includes a fundraising or a revenue generation plan. If you're charitable, that's a fundraising plan. If you're a nonprofit association, well, then that could be part of your business plan. It could be part of your strategic plan going forward. It needs to include plans for how you're going to diversify the organization's funding and revenue sources for its long-term sustainability. And third, getting back to what I said before about committing to grants only if it meets one of the 4 following conditions. 1, if you look at a grant that comes before you and you're confident you meet every single one of the grant requirements, bang on, and you can say that with absolute confidence. 2, you're willing to do extensive research on finding the right ones. There's a lot of them out there, but they all have their little pet projects as well. And you're willing at the same time to invest important staff time or volunteer time into writing a tailored response to each and every single one of those funding requirements. 3, you already have some funding as well that's been guaranteed, or that you've had an experience perhaps in this similar area as well. That certainly helps. And 4th, understand that more often than not, first-time applications are not accepted. That's the stats on this, folks. So commit to the grants only if you understand those 4 elements. And fourth, as well, you need to be, as an organization in this online era, thinking about the development of your online outreach and fundraising efforts, whether that's reaching out towards stakeholders and funders, potential sponsors, members, donors as well. Folks, these are the 4 areas that you should be thinking about long term. It's not going to fix the wheel there, you fix your situation immediately, but in the long run, this is going to set your organization on a much more sustainable path towards what I call nonprofit rehab, financial rehab, nonprofit financial rehab. If you're really interested in learning more about this, you can find out more. Reach out to me directly, Mark Buzan. I'm here on Facebook, as I mentioned, on Periscope, and on YouTube. Send me a comment, reach out. I'd love to have a conversation with you as well. You can find out more about the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors at nonprofitboarddirectors.org. And look, thank you so much for listening and for sharing, and I hope to have more dialogue with you in the near future.